Have you ever wondered how women in the Victorian era, dressed in those massive crinolines and puffy gowns, actually managed everyday things like going to the toilet or dealing with their period? It's something most history books leave out. But today, we're going to lift the layers, quite literally, and uncover the hidden realities of Victorian hygiene, toilets, and menstruation. This is Tales of Pain. Don't forget to subscribe to support the channel. The challenge of crinolines. For decades in the 1800s, women wore crinolines in enormous skirts. Queen Victoria herself popularized this style. These gowns symbolized ideals of femininity and social class, but they weren't exactly practical. Imagine trying to sit down, walk through a doorway, or relieve yourself while wearing several pounds of fabric. Where did Victorians go? In the early Victorian era, most households didn't have flushing toilets, sewers were rare, and indoor plumbing was still developing. The average person had to improvise. If nature called, you might slip behind a tree, find a field, or use a chamber pot indoors. Chamber pots were ceramic or metal bowls, usually with lids, and they were everywhere, tucked under beds, hidden inside chairs, or placed in closets. The poor often owned just one pot for the entire household. If you didn't have a pot at all, you went outside. That's where the old saying, "not having a pot to piss in," comes from. It literally meant you were dirt poor. And disposal? Often chamber pots were emptied directly into the street below. In some cities, residents even shouted "Gardez-l'eau," from the French "Regardez l'eau," watch out for the water, before tossing their waste from the window. Streets became open sewers, which is partly why parasols and high-heeled shoes became popular, to avoid splashes from filth. The strange uses of waste. Here's a surprising twist. During wars like the Napoleonic and English Civil Wars, governments collected human waste. Why? Because urine could be refined into saltpeter, a key ingredient for making gunpowder. Yes, people's chamber pots literally helped fuel the battlefield. Women, fashion, and toileting now. Let's get to the tricky part. How women actually use these chamber pots while wearing dresses the size of small tents. A proper Victorian lady wore layer upon layer. A linen shift, several petticoats, a cage crinoline, the overskirt, and finally, a bodice. But here's the clever detail. They usually didn't wear underwear. Knickers only became common later in the century after a few embarrassing incidents of skirts blowing upward in the wind. Instead, early Victorian drawers were crotchless. This meant women could simply squat over a pot without undressing. Some pots were designed with oval shapes to fit between the thighs. Others were placed on the floor, while maids helped lift the skirts. At grand events, retiring rooms were set up with multiple pots and attendants ready to assist. The wiping question. So once the business was done, how did Victorians wipe? The answer might shock you. Poor families often used leaves, straw, or even handfuls of moss. Corn cobs were surprisingly popular, twisted to scrape clean. Sponges on sticks, rinsed in vinegar or salt water, were used by some. Later in the century, newspapers and catalog pages became common. Toilet paper as we know it wasn't mass-produced until the early 1900s. Until then, the experience was far rougher than we can imagine today. Menstruation in the Victorian era periods were a monthly reality, but there were no pads, tampons, or menstrual cups. Instead, women used what was called a tea bandage, essentially a cloth belt with absorbent rags pinned inside. Poor women sometimes relied on moss or other natural fibers. These rags were washed and reused, often changed 12 to 20 times a day. For lighter days, some women relied on thicker petticoats for extra absorption. Privacy was limited, and hygiene options were rudimentary. Interestingly, Victorian women had fewer periods than today. Poor nutrition and physical labor often disrupted cycles, and many women reached menopause earlier, sometimes in their mid-30s. Laundry and odor control. But what about those giant dresses themselves? With layers of fabric and no deodorant, wouldn't they smell terrible? Yes, and that's why laundry was a huge ordeal. The Great Wash was done just once or twice a year for major garments. Instead of washing with soap and water, dresses were often sprinkled with talcum powder and brushed clean. Undergarments like chemises and petticoats were laundered more often, but outer gowns could be worn until they were nearly transparent, or until the stench became unbearable. Clothing was stored in cedar trunks or closets to keep moths and pests away. Despite the beauty of Victorian fashion, many garments would today be considered biohazards. So, the next time you see a glamorous painting of a Victorian lady in her grand gown, remember the reality. Chamber pots, corn cobs, crotchless drawers, and an awful lot of talcum powder. Would you survive daily life in the Victorian era? Or would you long for modern plumbing and toilet paper? Let us know in the comments below. Thanks for watching Tales of Pain. If you enjoyed this deep dive into Victorian hygiene, hit the like button and subscribe for more unusual stories from the past.